Good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Evening, sir.
I'm sorry, but I am using right now a cell phone because I do not know what happened to the Wi-Fi here in our center. So I hope you can see me and you can hear me clearly.
Yes, we can,
Yes,
sir.
sir.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Mayong gabi sa tanan, maruyog ini kikilip kikimi tanan. Good evening, everyone. It's actually a great honor on my part to have been invited by the schools for the planet in partnership with the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative and the East West Center in Hawaii on this Stories of Creation 4-week virtual workshop that seeks to engage with young leaders from all over Southeast Asia in an interfaith and intercultural dialogue to celebrate faith-based work in conservation. Before anything else, I would like to introduce myself as a lay missionary of a faith-based organization called Servants of the Divine Mercy. We actually started with 42 young people in San Isidro Parish, Labrador Parish here in Binalbaga, Negros Occidental, Philippines. I actually co-founded this community that started from among 42 young people here in our place. And of course, I was assigned to the Indigenous Peoples Ministry of the community, and which is the service arm of our community. And for the past years, for almost 3 decades, I've been engaging myself with various IP advocacy and lay mission works here in our place. Now, actually, I would be focusing in my sharing. I would like to focus on 4 points. That is how our indigenous communities view the relationship with nature. What are the indigenous practices that promote environmental conservation? What is the status or the state of our indigenous conservationists in the Philippines? And what can we do to support our indigenous conservationists? So allow me to begin my sharing with the basic information about indigenous peoples. This data actually was taken from the cultural survival. Yeah, thank you. Now, in some countries, they are called the tribal peoples, first peoples, native peoples, and indigenous peoples. They constitute about 5% of the world's population, yet account for about 15% of the world's poor. There are approximately 370 or 400 million indigenous people in the world, belonging to 5,000 different groups in 90 countries worldwide. Indigenous peoples live in every region of the world, but about 70% of them live in Asia. There is no universally accepted definition for indigenous, though there are characteristics that lead to be common among indigenous peoples. They tend to have small population relative to the dominant culture of their community, of their country. However, in Bolivia and Guatemala, indigenous people make up more than half the population. They usually have or had their own language. Today, indigenous people speak some 4,000 languages. They have distinctive cultural traditions that are still practiced. They have or had their own land territory to which they are tied in myriad ways. They self-identify as indigenous. Indigenous peoples are often thought of as primary stewards of the planet's biological resources. Their ways of life and cosmovisions have contributed to the protection of the natural environment on which they depend on. It is no coincidence that when the World Wide Fund listed the top 200 areas with the highest and most threatened biodiversity, they found that 95% are on indigenous territories. Indigenous communities and the environments they maintain are increasingly under assault from mining, oil, dam building, logging, and agro-industrial projects. Indigenous communities resist this invasion with tremendous courage and skill, but their protests are too often ignored by government corporations and corporations. Now in the Philippines, following are the information about indigenous peoples, data taken actually from Fast Facts, UNDP 2010. The Philippines is a culturally diverse country with an estimated population of about 14 to 17 million, belonging to 110 ethno-linguistic groups. They are mainly concentrated in northern Luzon, which is about 33%, and Mindanao, 61%, and some groups in the Visayas area. Now, the Philippine Constitution, in recognition of this diversity and under the framework of national unity and development, mandates state recognition, protection, promotion, and fulfillment of the rights of indigenous peoples. Further, the Republic Act 8371, also known as the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, recognized the rights of IPs to manage their ancestral domains and thus become the cornerstone of current national policy on IPs. Yet despite these guarantees, the fact is that wherever IPs live, they remain among the poorest and among disadvantaged peoples. The first ever report on the state of the world of indigenous peoples issued by the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues in January 2010 revealed that IPs make up fully one-third of the world's poorest peoples, suffered disproportionately in areas like health, education, and human rights, and regularly face systemic discrimination and exclusion. IPs has been subject to historical discrimination and marginalization from political processes and economic benefit. They often face exclusion, loss of ancestral lands, displacement, pressures to and destruction of traditional ways of life and practices, and loss of identity and culture. In extreme situations, social and political discontent has erupted into communist insurgents in a prime example. Conflicts such as this not only threaten the stability and development potential of affected areas, they exacerbate the plight of indigenous peoples, from economic development to environmental protection to justice, human rights, and good governance. The protection and participation promised to indigenous peoples need to be mainstreamed through all relevant decision-making bodies and stakeholder organizations. Now, I am actually in Negros Island, and I would like to share a little about Negros Island. No, so there are about 700,000 indigenous peoples in Negros Island where I live, and I am directly working actually to about 153,000 indigenous peoples in southern Negros Occidental, where I work and where I stay. Now, the issues and concerns of IPs are varied actually, which I have already mentioned. From land insecurity and development, indeed this induced displacement, the chemical agriculture, proposed mega dam projects, restriction from self-governance and empowerment, social injustices and human rights violations, and non-awareness of cultural integrity by the mainstream people and IPs as well. Health is an issue that interlinks with the fourfold major rights of the indigenous peoples. Now, the indigenous peoples actually here in Negros are called Ati, Ata, the Bukidnon, and it has different subgroups actually. No, Bukidnon has different subgroups. We have Babaylanis Bukidnon, the Tuman Magat Bukidnon, the Bukidnon Magahat, the Tablanhon Bukidnon, Tabihanon Bukidnon, Bukidnon Tarcarolano, and so on and so forth. Some are actually called Magahat or Maghat. Now, next slide, please. Now, there are actually different issues here in our place, which I actually have already mentioned, ranging from the displacement of the people, cultural, from the loss of biodiversity, loss also, which is also equivalent to the loss of cultural diversity of the indigenous peoples, the loss of their language. So next slide, please. Now, so this is actually a problem here in our place because um, one of well, which one that I would like to mention here is about what Pope Francis said. No, next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. So we are faced now with two separate crises, one environmental and the other social, but rather with one complex crisis, which is both social and environmental. Strategies for a solution demand an integrated approach to combating poverty, restoring dignity to the excluded, and at the same time, protecting nature. So this is what Pope Francis said, no, about the issues and challenges of the indigenous peoples. So next slide, please. Now, I would like to share IP's relationship with nature. UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, or the UNDESA, it emphasized the rights to lands, territories, and resources are at the heart of indigenous people's struggles around the world. Indigenous people's relationships to the ancestral lands are source of cultural, spiritual, and social identity and form the basis of their traditional knowledge systems. Next slide. Now, in 2013, no? In 2013, I was actually documenting the ancient peace agreement of the Ituman Maghat Bukidnon tribe here in our place. It's actually in an adjacent municipality or city here called Himamaylan City. Silvestri Taibiting Pacheco, a 90-year-old Kalanyan, told me. He told me that during the early days, this place was filled with rainforest. Anyone who says sour, bitter, and salt will experience rain right away. Wild food is abundant everywhere, and we didn't experience hunger. We have everything we need in order to live. But when the three loggers came, we felt intimidated. We felt being driven from our own ancestral lands. We cannot anymore practice freely our indigenous knowledge systems, practices, and spirituality. We felt the loss of our identity. When loggers who speak Ilonggo or Hiligaynon came, they would tell us not to speak our language, and the same with Cebuano speaking. We felt having been stripped with our bahags or G-strings. Our identity as people was taken from us by the loggers. Later, when all the old trees were gone, we felt the scarcity of food and water, biodiversity, and cultural diversity lost, and our language was also eventually lost. Many of our traditional practices like panghuman was done secretly. We were discriminated and ridiculed by the lowlanders. So to the indigenous peoples, land is life. Now next slide, please. Now, what are the practices that promote environmental conservation? First, actually, I would like to say everything and everyone is sacred according to the indigenous peoples. There was an experience actually of one writer, which I actually just read from our voice. One day, Father Albert Alijo, a Jesuit, was invited to a meeting with indigenous leaders in Mindanao. At lunchtime, as they were about to eat, one of the leaders said, "Since we have a priest with us, perhaps we should say a prayer." And Father Alijo said, "If I am not with you, will you be saying a prayer?" The answer was, "No, Father, because you see, we gave thanks to the land when it is received, when it received the seeds. We gave thanks to the seeds when they sprouted and yielded. We gave thanks when we harvested. We gave thanks when we cooked. So by the time the food is served, Father, it is already sacred." So Father Alijo told us this story to remind us that the indigenous peoples and their sense of the sacred whole is intact. Their consciousness is not split into secular and sacred. Everything and everyone is sacred to them. Now, last January, and February 2016, I had the chance actually to have an encounter with the Babaylans or Babaylanism and some Panghuman rituals, no? Which is part actually of the Babaylanism practice. Now, the five Babaylans, his wife, and two descendants from the former practicing Babaylans from the Ituman Magat Bukidnon that is here in Binalbagan where I live, have the following information during the focus group discussion. They all started practicing Babaylan between the ages of 25 to 37 years old. They said, we became Babaylan because the responsibility was transferred by our ancestors to our parents and to us, while one answered that he just had a vision and a dream, and he found the prayer book and other tools and instruments on his altar. Then he started practicing the Babaylan as Babaylan. In our dreams, the ancestors and spirits are pushing us to practice the Babaylanism because there are a lot of people who needs our help. Now, usually, Babaylanism actually is a practice. No? It's a kind of, it's a spirituality actually. It's an age-old spirituality. It's a faith expression actually. It's not only healing, it's not only about shamanism, but it's about actually spirituality of the people during the ancient period. Now, I have actually several stories here to tell about the Babaylan, but I would like to skip this. No, I would like to go to another. The Pangalap. No, Pangalap actually is a practice of the indigenous peoples, the Bukidnon, and even the Ati here in our place, to gather medicinal plants to be made as concoctions, and they will use this for their families and in healing the community who are sick. Now, another practice is Ranso. Ranso actually is a practice of the Ati of going out with their families. Maybe 3 to 10 families will go together, trekking the mountains, traveling the course of the rivers in order to gather food, wild food, raw materials for the weaving, medicinal plants. They gather medicinal plants to be made as concoctions. And during this time, while they are traveling on Ranso, they would come together, make a small house, where they can take a rest. And there, they would teach their children their language, dances, history, indigenous games, and many intangible cultural heritage to be transferred to the next generation. Same with Big C. Big C also is a practice of isolating oneself. When someone is sick, for example, in a community, they won't allow anybody to get nearer or get inside the house of the sick person, nor the sick family, member of the family, they wouldn't be allowed to go out of their house. And if many in the community have been affected by the virus, for example, no one would be allowed to go out of their territory, nor outsiders would be allowed to get inside their territory. This is the lockdown now that we practice. Actually, this is an age-old practice of the Bukignons. No, they called it Biksi. Now, traditional governance systems. In traditional governance systems, actually, the indigenous peoples are using this traditional governance to actually control their territories, control their livelihood. The traditional governance system is actually sustainable. And why do I have to share all these practices with you? Because this is actually related to the indigenous people's connection with nature, with biodiversity. The loss of biodiversity is actually loss equivalent to the loss of their culture and also the loss of their language. Now, there are actually several practices that I would like to share, but since our time is limited, so I would like to proceed to the next, please. Okay, I would share a bit, no, on this. This is actually a school of living tradition, no, of the Ati. Here, actually, indigenous, the living cultural heritage is being taught in this center, no, in the community. And as you can see there, some of the products are there, not the weave materials. The materials actually, the raw materials actually are, well, they have to harvest it actually from the forest. And they use this to teach the next generation so that this practice will not be lost. And they call this schools for living tradition, the Buhi Initurun an Kita Maanak Ki Marikudo. Next, please. Next slide, please. Now that's actually a picture and some products from the weaving of the women. No, these women actually are a group of women organized in a community, and they are doing this rara, this weaving, in order to have income, in order to augment the livelihood actually of their families. So next slide, please. Now, Inati dance, that's just an example of Inati dance. Next slide. Ranso, no, that I mentioned it already. Ranso, it is their practice actually of gathering plants. And Big C actually, no, it was actually well, last year during the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, not in 2020, they actually hold Big C, which is actually a ritual of praying that the people will not be affected with virus such as COVID-19 and even its variants. So they have to use the ritual actually to pray and to do this ritual, you know, of driving out the virus, you know, from the people in their communities, and even praying for the people around the world. So that's a big C actually. Next slide, please. Pangalap, no? I have mentioned it already. It's the way of gathering medicinal plants, you know, as to be prepared as concoctions for their healing purposes. Next slide. Now, the Babaylanis Bukignon, that is also a ritual, no, that in the picture actually is Tailibi Montesino. It's actually a ritual, you know, praying for healing. It's a Babaylanism practice actually of praying and healing and dancing. So actually they dance, you know, when they pray and they do the rituals. Next slide, please. Okay, this guy actually is an 18-year-old youth from Panay Bukidnon. He's actually doing panubok. He's actually a learner from the School of Living Tradition from Panay Island. And using panubok, he actually has earned income for himself and for his family. And even it helped him even in his schooling. So this is just one example of practices of indigenous peoples. Next slide. Virginia Nabat, no, cultural master, I have mentioned her already. Next slide. Now, this is what she said, actually, Virginia Nabat. We are the last generation who can speak our language fluently. Few of our children can speak our language. If we want to do something to preserve this intangible cultural heritage, then this is our last hooray. We would never be identified as Ati people in the future. You could never identify us as Ati people. When we speak our language, as if the soul of our ancestors are still living among us and living within us. We have the sense of connection to the past. Inati language stirs our spirit when we speak, and I am convinced that I am an Ati. Inati language is our identity. When we lose this language, we lost our identity as a people forever. So this is what Virginia said. And this is actually in relation to the practices of the indigenous peoples, which I have mentioned earlier, actually. Next slide, please. Now, well, this is actually an IP month celebration last October. In fact, we still have webinars on this, until tomorrow. So we call it Dayao. This is actually well, it's one way of giving awareness actually to the people in the Philippines, especially the mainstream. This is one way of sharing the indigenous knowledge systems and practices and spirituality. Next slide, please. Still, it's an IP month celebration. So Ranso was mentioned there, and the Big C. Next slide, please. Now, the state of indigenous conservationists in the Philippines. Well, I would like to start actually with okay, so this is actually Virginia Nabat. On the next slide, please. I have mentioned this. Okay. Now, ICCA project by GEF says, conserving unique biodiversity relies on the knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities who live in direct contact with nature. Next slide, please. Now, it is said that a local leadership governing and managing natural resources is increasingly becoming a critical solution for both people and nature. Next slide, please. Now, this is actually a report, a report conducted on the state of indigenous peoples and local communities, lands and territories. This is actually a technical review of the state of indigenous peoples and local communities that I would like to share. Now, the first actually is, it's stated, this report stated that indigenous peoples and local communities, or IPLCs, are vital custodians of the world's remaining natural landscapes. So this report also emphasized that indigenous peoples are vital custodians of the remaining natural landscapes. Second, majority of indigenous peoples and local communities' lands are in good ecological conditions. Third, IPLC lands in good ecological conditions are globally significant. Fourth, IPLC lands are associated, and associated waters comprise and protect a large portion of areas particularly important for biodiversity. Now, next slide, please. Fifth, ecologically representative conservation relies on IPLC custodians and thus can only be achieved through appropriate recognition of and support for IPLC land and resource rights. Sixth, supporting IPLCs are custodians of nature, provides widespread benefits and services for all humanity. Seventh, over a quarter of IPLC lands face high development pressure in the future. And sixth and eighth, global results cannot be translated into national level policy without in-depth assessments involving nationally appropriate data sets and crucially, the full participation of IPLCs. Now, I remember, okay, so that's actually the state of indigenous conservation, which actually shows the global lands, and the 20.5% IPLC lands in good ecological condition, and the 32.2% IPLC lands. It's not really very clear, but that's what the figure actually says. Now and also the overlap between the IPLC lands and the protected areas was shown also in this picture. Next slide, please. Now in the Philippines, it's a Philippine map. I do not know if the map is clear, but in the Philippines, IPLC lands are similarly vital for conservation, covering at least 15% of the country. There may be additional IPLC lands not included in this map, with appropriate recognition of rights to land and territories and support to the associated IPLC governance systems. Following IPLC consent, IPLC lands could increase the area protected or conserved in the Philippines from 16%. Key biodiversity area coverage. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay. Now, IPLC lands overlap with 88 of the country's 129 key biodiversity areas, an area of over 18,000 square meters. Two key BAs that lack coverage by non-IPLC protected areas are 100% covered by IPLC lands, and 25% of the country's total key BA area is covered by IPLC lands. Next slide, please. Now, ecoregion coverage. On the 12 ecoregions in the Philippines, 8 overlap at least partially with IPLC. 4 of these are more than 20% covered by IPLC lands. Next slide, please. Now, ecological condition. A large area of IPLC land in the Philippines has experienced only low levels of human modification, indicating good ecological condition, but part of this same area may face greater pressure in the future. 1/3 of IPLC land is currently in good ecological condition. And third, not all IPLC lands are free from industrial development. However, with 53 active power plants located in IPLC lands. Next slide, please. Now, future development pressure. In the future, 23% of IPLC land in the Philippines may face high development pressure. Next. And what does this mean? No, IPLC lands are vital to ecologically representative conservation in the Philippines and to the protection of many of the country's most important areas for biodiversity. All data used for the Philippine case study assessed through landmark are for lands both acknowledged by the government and documented. This fact is encouraging given that almost a quarter of IPLC land in the country could face high development pressure in the future. However, it is important to acknowledge that unrecognized lands are less likely to be mapped. And mapped lands will also require appropriate recognition and support in order to retain their conservation values in the future various development pressures. Next slide. Indigenous people are actually world's biggest conservationists, but they rarely get credit for it. Tai Biting actually once said, which I mentioned actually earlier, that when the loggers came to their land and cut all the trees, that's the time actually that they lost everything. They felt the discrimination, the marginalization during the time. Now, next slide, please. Now, what support can we share? What support can we do actually? Can we give to our indigenous conservationists? First, actually, these are actually my suggestions, practical suggestions. First, well, you can participate and conduct awareness raising activities like International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, the IP Month celebration, the IP Sunday and IP Day celebrated in various ways. Second, respect the rights, the rights of indigenous peoples. Conservation with respect to human rights of the peoples who are living there, who are managing these areas. Third, recognize them as conservationists and caretakers, shepherds, or stewards of biodiversity. Recognize land tenure systems, access rights, and many other things. Change our worldview of nature exists to serve humans, but actually humans coexist with nature. Governments should respect the indigenous knowledge, values, and innovations. Include IPs in the climate change discussions. Next, protect indigenous land rights by getting involved in the activities, projects, and programs. Recognize their indigenous political structures or systems and help them in their local governance participation through IP mandatory representation in the local government units. Local Culture and Arts Council should be participated by the indigenous peoples as well as other policy-making bodies and the legislatives. The indigenous people should participate in this. Now, schools of living tradition should be mainstreamed with policy support from the LGUs for sustainability. We can also promote indigenous groups and their products. Investment on indigenous youth is also important. Like the event you have right now, it is worth actually supporting and promoting. So we thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to participate in your activity. I hope our indigenous youth could take part in this endeavor in the future. Madamo gid nga salamat, maruyog ini pagdugok, mim kiamim, daghang salamat.